there can be a general west wind at Slide Mountain. If it's light enough, you're launching 1,000 feet below the summit, so you get the whole east face heating up. So you get just the slope flow and the thermals coming up the east side, and those are, that's your kind of your micro scale, and it's overcoming it. And then at a certain time of the day, the west will often mix down. So those are things you just have to be aware of. At any one place, the wind you feel is the superposition of winds at different levels. And it's just, when the forecast said something and you felt wind that was much stronger, it could have been just the place that you were. The forecast can't, certain things like a venturi, an acceleration through an arrow, or a gap flow, similar to a venturi, not quite, but a bigger gap. Those things, most of that is not really picked up by the models, nor is ridge top compression. You've often noticed that right at the top of if it's windy, right at the top of the ridge, it can be really strong. And it's actually stronger than if you're at that same level further away from the ridge. What's a great way of seeing that is if you look at, here we have the advantage of the sounding that goes up out of Oakland twice a day. That's the weather balloon that takes a profile of temperature, dew point temperature, and wind speed and direction through the levels. And I don't have time in here, nor would it would just be kind of complicated to teach how to read a skew-T log P diagram where the sounding is plotted, but it's very useful to learn that. Skew-T log P diagram tutorials are on the web, and you learn to read a skew-T, especially since we have an Oakland sounding which is very close. They're about 200 miles apart, so here we're pretty fortunate to have one this close. The next one over is in Reno, then we got one up in Medford, and then you got to go, I think, down to Vandenberg, I believe is the next one south. So they're pretty, it's a pretty coarse, they're pretty far apart. There's about 100 launched in the U.S., about 900 worldwide, but it helps the weather models just see what the wind is doing. Being close to one, if your flying sight is close to a sounding, it's worth taking the time to learn to read a sounding, because then it's one of my quick links on my phone. I'll pull it up, and I can see the fingerprint of a good day. I can quickly see here how deep is the marine layer, what are the winds above it, what are the winds within the layer. Is quickly pulling up a sounding at work. I can see, okay, I'm not missing anything today. I'm like, oh no, I wish I was flying today. So that okay. When it comes to since a lot of the stuff that we fly in is not resolved, a lot of it is not actually even truly scientifically understood exactly how it behaves. I mean, the closest we can come to seeing thermals is they sometimes use a LiDAR, which is like a laser that scans back and forth like this, an eye-safe laser that goes out about 8 kilometers, and it picks up, you can see the differences in the fine dust particles. And there's animations of that, and you can actually kind of watch thermals, throughout the day start to come on. And what thermals are is it's convection. It's kind of the air starts to boil, and heating from the bottom or cooling from aloft. If there's cold air moving in aloft, both of those things promote thermals, and vice versa. If the bottom stops heating, then the thermals start shutting down. Or it can be very hot. It can be a very hot blue day, but if there's warm air moving in over the top, you're warming from the bottom and the top. It's just getting hot and hotter, but there's not that great a thermal. So keep in mind that it's a push-pull situation. So in general, wind, kind of general rules to think of, wind usually increases with height. The big exception to that is valley winds. You can have a very light, kind of benign synoptic day. There can be big high pressure sitting over the area, and somewhere up in a mountain launch, you can be 11, 12 o'clock, and there's no wind, barely a few cycles coming up launch. And the valley winds can already be just honking really strong, just because it's, on those days, often when it's really clear and sunny out, you develop a heat low in the mountains, and it starts to draw in a lot of air through the valleys, and it can be very windy in the landing zone. So that's where an exception to the rule of wind increasing with height. It can be perfectly launchable. Looks like there's no issue with launching on launch. It can be quite windy in the landing area. So if you can have any kind of information on that wind, or call somebody in the valley if you're not sure, that's good. If it's a totally unknown place, if you're there alone or something, you might just want to be aware of that. There's a place I remember back in the 90s in Venezuela. It was called La Trampa, the trap, translated. And it kind of was a trap. I mean, it was exactly what I was talking about. Very light cycles on launch, and you'd be going backwards by 11 o'clock in the LZ. You'd have to set up your landing almost backwards if you launched at that time. So just had to be something to be kind of keep in mind. Also, in general, within the troposphere, temperature decreases with height, but then there's inversions. Here it's very pronounced with the marine layer. It can be an inversion of almost, on some days, of almost 20 Celsius. Air gets, a lot warmer above a certain height, and that pretty much acts as a lid to the thermals. Now I like to think of an inversion as kind of a trampoline from the bottom. And like thermals can be like hyperactive kids under the trampoline, and their head hits it every now and then. You would see that surface, bounce up a little bit, but they get forced back down. So it's not a hard surface, and depending how pronounced the inversion is how far up the thermal might push up into it. You sometimes feel in some places you're thermaling, and you feel like maybe you've broken through it for a little bit because you're, often down in the layer, pollutants accumulate, and the air is kind of hazy, and you get above it and you kind of see the blue sky for a moment. But you might just be in an overshooting thermal that's already now just running out of steam. It's it's moving on momentum, but it's already negatively buoyant, and you'll soon bop back down. When you hear of people breaking through inversions, or usually that if a thermal is breaking through an inversion, which you sometimes hear about, that really means that locally at that place where that happened, there wasn't that much of an inversion left. It was probably a pretty strong thermal, but it wasn't a very strong inversion left, because thermals don't break from strong inversions, or it might have been just a very skinny height-wise inversion. But it is possible you could still have a pretty strong inversion over the valley, and then over the slopes it's kind of eroded away, and then you can kind of get up to the next level. So sometimes people bench up to the next level where everybody's left flying and below a certain level in the valleys, and it's just because the way along the slope they were able to kind of get through it in a certain localized area. There wasn't much of an inversion left. Convergence, when wind wraps around a certain feature, usually nice convergence is where it's a fairly large feature and the wind is channeled and kind of hits itself, and then it has nowhere to go but up. Now you can get convergence or you can get confluence. You can have confluence, it kind of comes together and it doesn't really go up, or there's, in general, a really strong capping inversion won't let it go up. But often if there is a convergence, I've found it's kind of the most elusive kind of lift, where you don't, unless you know that place and it comes in like clockwork and you can kind of learn where it is down. I haven't flown in Elsinore personally, but I know they've got it kind of, they know, they've flown it long enough to where they know where it comes in, at what time, under what conditions. Sometimes you stumble upon one. Sometimes looking at the topography and looking at which way the valley winds go, you can kind of see a place where one should occur. And I've found often they slant. When the winds slam each other, rarely are they exactly the same strength. It's rarely the textbook together and straight up. It's more of one stagnates the other and creates a bit of a ramp. So you would see the wind in a convergence often going up a little bit of an angle rather than totally straight up. In feeling-wise, it gets manifest often like extra thermals in that area. Often you can, in the area of convergence, you get up higher than you would in thermals in general, in that, like on that day. So it's an area that kind of enhances, feels like enhanced thermals, and it's one of those things that takes a while for. It often happens, under the same. If it's high pressure, which I'd call it synoptically benign, clear skies, same time of year, things tend to happen on schedule because the Earth is receiving, the same amount of heating throughout the day. It's kind of things tend to kind of, happen on schedule. So in those situations, valley winds will come on at the same time, and then convergence, if it's occurring, might set up at a certain place and might either hang in that place or migrate. Like I said, rarely is one wind exactly the same strength as the other as they hit each other. So it might start somewhere and then move along. Also, what I've found under a convergence is often the air is fairly right there on the ground is an area, like if you're driving around and you see you're driving somewhere and the wind's been coming from this lake and coming around and it's pretty windy, and then you drive through a calm area and then it's coming from a different direction. So often under the convergence, and like I said, they're slanted, so it might not be directly underneath it, but at the surface part of the convergence, it's quite calm because the wind has kind of negated each other, slammed itself, and it's now being forced to go up. And sometimes if it's quite windy, now this is kind of an advanced thing, but that might be the best place if you have to land or if you want to get out of the sky. You might have this strip of very calm wind where it's quite windy on one side, quite windy on the other side, and right there, of course, it means getting down through the convergence. It means getting down through a lot of lift. But
I'm just going to jump in here for a second. I'm going to talk about the specifics with the convergence, which is like a regular highway, and I'll show you on the map. And it's basically, this is where you go. It's almost like clockwork every day in the summer. So just want to jump in with the areas.
okay, what I wanted to talk. Let's see, where was I? Okay, just a second. Convergence. Okay, stability. Okay, so understanding thermals, like I said, you have to. Thermals are basically the air's gotten less dense and more buoyant than its surroundings. So it's unstable. It wants to go up. That is the sort of, if you think of the depth from the ground to where the thermals top off, we call that the boundary layer. It's got the surface layer, the mixed layer, and then entrainment zone. The surface layer is where the air is being heated, the ground is being heated by the sun, which in turn heats the air. It creates a large kind of pool of extra warm, buoyant air. If it's on the flats, it can kind of hang there for a little bit. If it's on a slope, rarely will more buoyant air just doesn't hang still on the slope side. It'll start to develop a slope flow. Just if you're more buoyant, if you get less dense than the surrounding air, and you're on a slope, you're naturally just going to start flowing up the slope, which often draws in air from the flatter areas. That is also more buoyant, and things tend to ride up the mountain. So if you have terrain features, it's just natural that it's more likely that you're going to find the rising air above a raised feature like a mountain or a hilltop than out over the valley. It's not that the air isn't heating over the valley, but it just naturally flows towards that mountain. It's kind of the idea almost, the fact that, it's not flowing from the mountain because there's a physical mountain there. It's the idea if you're around the campfire, and especially if you're the only person around the campfire on a still night, no matter where you move, you kind of find that the smoke tends to go towards you. And part of that is because you're blocking that. It can flow from all sides, but from where you're standing. So it feels like the smoke keeps chasing you around in an annoying fashion. But that's kind of how you can think of, like, thermals will tend to track up a mountain face because there's no wind coming directly from the mountain itself. So everything, the natural slope flow by the mountain face is pulling things in, and then it'll draw in air from the flats. That's not to say that you can't have a small bump out front, set off a thermal somewhere out front. And often the best thermals might not track their way all the way up to the mountain. They'll come off the knolls out front, because if you have to think of source areas, like if it's a really large area that's heating, that's your source area for that thermal, and then you have to think, okay, where's that gonna trigger off? So, for example, Slide Mountain, sometimes it makes sense to fly out and commit to going out over the knolls. There you encounter the thermals higher up, because right near the terrain, it's sometimes hard to catch a thermal unless it's a really strong one. Once it's been up above the terrain, it's usually sometimes several thermals converge on almost like roots of a tree to a trunk, and then you can get the thermal out further and above the knolls. And that's, I found, I started in the Bay Area, started doing, in the 90s, a lot of ridge soaring, and that's a really hard thing to do, is to leave, like, if you can just barely maintain on a hillside, you want to kind of, the tendency to soar next to something that's working, and the commitment to risk sinking out and head out and hope to encounter the thermals that are coming off the knolls or off the features for more out in front. But often that's what's necessary to get the really good thermal.
Let me jump in here just a second for the Bay Area. If you look up here, typically we have a west to northwest flow typically. Usually we'll fly south a little bit. On the lee side of every little knoll, you usually have a little thermal bubble picking up. So what Honza is saying, instead of staying on the windward side, you look, yeah, you're staying where you are, maybe in zero sync, a little more. But if you want to go for it, just go. If you go, you'll probably catch that little lee side thermal going up. It's like a little bubble, and you'll stay in that. And as you go, you'll get another one, and they'll converge, and you get maybe three. And now pretty soon you have like a chunk of the tree going up, and now you're styling going down. So every lee side of every little ridge here usually has a little something going on. So I just want to jump in for the.
Should you worry about rotor on those lee side thermals though?
Oh, for sure. But so you have to judge the strength of the wind. For sure, if it's stronger, then okay. If you judge it, it's a mental thing. If you're in a strong thermal, and let's say you go into a lee side, you're in a strong thermal, and you have a really strong wind, now you got to make a decision. Is that thermal stronger than the wind? If it's not, sure, then you're going to get turbulent. But if you think it's stronger than the wind, you go for it. The typical example of that is at Diablo many times, because you go up at Diablo and you're getting a really nice strong thermal, but on the lee side of it, you'll have some winds ripping through there. So you have to make the decision, is it going to be strong enough to go over that valley? Because if you sink, you're going to be in big trouble, or not leave. So
that's a great question. My rule tends to be about a 1-to-1 glide. Like, usually you want to keep a very steep glide for getting back. You want to make sure the wind that if you're deciding the thermal behind, like up and behind a ridge line, first always make sure that wind isn't stronger than your forward speed. If it is, it's very advanced flying. When you're starting to go over ridges where the wind is stronger than your forward speed, that's very advanced cross-country flying, and that's still, you'd want to hop that thermal not at the ridge line, well out in front, so you're like maybe 1,000 feet over or above the ridge before you're going over. But usually, exactly, you want to evaluate that thermal. You never want to take a weak thermal over the back. If you're taking a thermal over the back, you want to make sure that, I would say, that you have, if you lose it all of a sudden, then you've got the penetration speed to go forward, and you haven't put yourself like 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 glide behind that ridge top, because then you might not make it back in front of the ridge, and you might be forced to run, or just depending on how the lee looks, it can put you in a hole.
And just a quick show, in back of Diablo, if you take a weak thermal over and you're going to sink, you have big power lines right back here. So you got to be real careful about that.
Shocks and second deal. Okay. Yeah, so speaking of small thermals, sometimes you're connecting. You got to be a little careful when you decide to circle, because certain thermals can feel really good when you enter them, but then by the time you've done a full circle, you're lower than you started, and you've lost. And sometimes gusts can feel a lot like entering a wind gust can feel very much like you've entered a thermal. And I like to call them sucker thermals. Martin always would remind me, like, "Oh, Dad, you just circle in a sucker thermal," or he would tell me, "Don't circle. It's a sucker thermal." So you know, there are some little sucker thermals that kind of my sort of general rule of thumb is if you can get lift for about 3 seconds, you should be able to fit a circle into it and go up. But it can be, you know, there are certain things that can feel like, wow, this is great. I'm going to hook this thermal, and by the time you've brought your full circle around, you're lower than when you started. And if that happens way up there, you got a lot of room. That's fine. If it's down low, then you're that much closer to sinking out. So just kind of figure out, you know, depending on how. A lot of this is also personal. What kind of turn rate you feel comfortable with, and if you, you know, usually when you start flying, you're not hooking really tight, and you should be also careful about that because you might not know the spin point of your glider and all these things. So you want to, you know, kind of figure out how, you know, sometimes time your circle in a thermal, I would say. And I was always surprised. I did that a few times. I was like, I'm about 12 seconds. I always thought it was far less than that. But 12 seconds, so, you know, that means if you'd probably want to be almost 4 seconds going through lift to get a 12 second circle in there. Kind of that whole, you know, diameter times pi.
And I got to jump in again. We all talk about circles, but no one really thinks about ovals. The wind's pushing the thermal. If you do a circle, you may get half your wing and then you're out of it. If you think about just spending a little more time going downwind, doing a oval type of shape instead of a regular circle. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I found that's true. The oval works different ways. Sometimes the thermal's kind of tracking up the hillside, and you got to follow it back towards the hill. But sometimes in stronger winds, you almost have to like spend a little more time on the upwind side of it, just to not fall out the back. So it's not always in wind do you track it. Do you spend more time on? You're either tracking it slightly upwind or sometimes you're tracking it slightly downwind, and that's just the art of thermaling. Just kind of, I mean, to this day, 25 plus years later, I'm still trying to figure out thermaling. I mean, it's you spend a lifetime trying to figure it out. Yeah. Okay, so let me see the weather stuff. Okay, yeah. Why? So surface heterogeneity. So different types of surface. You know, part of the reason why two things will make the air more buoyant. You either heat it and make it less dense, or you introduce a gas that's less dense into it. Now, water vapor is less dense, so yes, adding water vapor, evaporating water vapor into the air makes it less dense and therefore more buoyant. But at one time, just out of curiosity, did the math on this, and it's about 12 times more energetically expensive to evaporate water into the air to decrease its density than to just heat it. So that's why desert areas where there's no water under strong sun produce really cranking thermals, especially over dark surfaces. Whereas the more humid or wet the surface is, like grassy areas, tend to produce mellower thermals because a lot of the energy that's coming in is being used to evaporate water. And yes, evaporating water will make the air less dense, but at a much higher price. So for the given amount of energy, you're just not going to produce as strong a thermal. Go ahead. Okay, so cloud suck is when you arrive at the base of clouds. The clouds, before there's a significant inversion, could be a lot higher. So the clouds can be fairly deep. Small fair weather cumulus clouds that are not very deep usually won't have much cloud suck because that inversion is strong enough. Even despite the fact that you're now forming cloud, you change the rate of cooling because now you're releasing condensation of water releases heat. So it's almost like you've boosted that thermal. But if they're really kind of fair weather cumulus clouds, they're not going to have cloud suck. Cloud suck's going to be the bigger clouds that have maybe 1,000 feet or more, I would say, of vertical and then that thermal arriving there is actually gets a little bit of an acceleration. So, you know, if you kind of thought of a speed profile, it would take a little while for it to ramp up and it'd have a pretty high speed in the middle. Normally, as you get towards the top, that entrainment zone, if things are slowing down, but that cloud, if it's tall enough, will actually force an acceleration. That it's accelerating as it enters that cloud, so therefore underneath that cloud there'll be a little bit of an acceleration to the thermal. So that, I would kind of, rule of thumb is how big is that cloud? Is it towering? Sometimes they say taller than wide is a little bit of an indicator, but you can get some really wide and tall ones, like when you get out over Nevada, and those you just have to be careful. Yeah, they're just tall and wide. They're big. Now, the other thing to watch out for in general with clouds is the transition from shallow convection to deep convection. So shallow convection is boundary layer convection, basically from the ground to the top. If there's blue thermals, that would just be the top of lift. If there's fair weather cumulus, it'd be kind of for us cloud base or the tops of those cumulus. And then deep convection is basically cumulonimbus thunderstorms. It's the whole troposphere now convecting. So like I said, you know, the boiling of air, we like to fly in the air that boils just from the ground up to kind of fair weather cumulus top, you know, several thousand, or sometimes in the high mountain deserts, 10,000 feet deep, but still not topped with large towering cumulonimbus clouds. And that transition can be very quick. You can, you know, it can be a thunderstorm once it does decide to grow somewhere. You know, if there's a lot of humid air that's accumulated, and part of how you allow a lot of humid air to accumulate is you've got a pretty strong inversion. If there wasn't a strong inversion, if right from the morning there's really tall, you know, it'll start out as tall, skinny cumulus clouds, but kind of that a day that's going to storm kind of gives you the hints in the morning hours if it's going to storm early. Now, some days are just capped by a strong inversion, and it'll be the one afternoon thunderstorm over the high ground that'll break through. But when it does, that can happen, you know, fairly quick. That can be, usually there's kind of the 15 to 20 minute convective overturning cycle. So like a thermal will often from the ground to its very top be about 15 to 20 minutes. But so will air in a thunderstorm, which means it's got to go from the surface up to 30,000 feet in about 15 to 20 minutes. So you can think of the ascent rates in that. And in thunderstorms, we can become confetti to a vacuum cleaner is the way I like to think about it. I mean, short of free falling out, we're going up, and we're, you know, there's that great story of Eva. Luckily she survived, but she got hoovered up to 30,000+ feet and spit out and survived to tell about it. But most people who've been through that haven't survived, like getting to a thunderstorm.
What about the benign, usable clouds? Like if you're approaching, say, Cloud Street, do you find the usable layer was right under the clouds, or you just
Yeah, part of that is because, well, a lot depends right on how deep the clouds are, but you're still, the nice thing is you kind of, if you split into thirds, the bottom third, the thermal's still accelerating. It's got its best speed in the middle third, very crudely, and then the top third, it can be slowing down. But if still kind of the top third is the cloud, let's say, or you could find more or less, you can zoom along, because you're still somewhere near the top part of the second third or the bottom part of the last third. It can be a really nice lift, and the clouds are marking it too, so you can just kind of zip along on a cloud streak. That's, speaking of that, kind of goes to the convective patterns that like to set up the most. There's two. If you have the same kind of surface, like an open body of ocean, so it's all the same surface, same warmth. If there's wind, you'll tend to set up cloud streaks. If it's not windy, you'll tend to set up this honeycomb or cracked mud-looking pattern. And that'll, as soon as you start to introduce different surface types, that'll break down. As soon as you throw in, you know, dry versus wet ground, mountain types, that starts to kind of that starts to break down a little bit. Okay, let's see. In the mountains, okay, so I want to say just why mountains are often just better for thermals. Couple things. You get often, especially the mountaintops, tend to be drier unless they're snow covered. They tend to be a little less vegetated, so you got a lot more rocks. When you create a lot of deep valleys, you get kind of what they call the valley amplification factor. You basically, a smaller volume of air is being heated by more surface, so it just, the heating rate for that amount of air can be greater. Also, if you go up to altitude, another thing to think about is the air is less dense, so with the same heating, there's, in a particular particular volume, there's less air there. It's less dense, so it takes less energy to heat that cubic meter, let's say, of air. So it's easier for the thermals to kick on. And one other thing, often in the mountains, the air tends to be cleaner. So if you see a really clear air day and the sun just feels hot on your face from the morning, things might turn on a little quicker because clarity of the air makes a big difference. If you don't have, if you've got a lot of aerosols, especially in the morning hours, the sun's got it's being attenuated. The other thing about a lot of aerosols or fine dust particles in the air is that in itself is acting not quite like an inversion, but it's in a stabilizing fashion, because all those fine dust particles are intercepting the sun's rays, and they can heat. Normally, clear air lets the sun pass through pretty much straight through and start heating the ground directly. If you think about it, if you're heating a lot of particles before you even get to the ground, you've done a lot of heating before you get to heat the ground, and that's a stabilizing thing. When you heat from the top and not as much from the bottom, then that's a stabilizing factor. So that's why, for example, in Ghana, Africa, the sun comes right overhead. It's an equatorial sun, but there's two things playing into it. It's kind of a slightly humid environment. Also, the air is just often so dirty from the Sahara dust and another pollution that it just doesn't feel like, it's not the rip and thermals you expect from the sun passing directly overhead. It just, those two things kind of mellow it out. And sometimes you want that. Sometimes you want things to be mellow. You don't want, if you're in the high mountain desert, really strong sun, really blue skies, things can be cranking by 9 a.m. and, just ballistic by noon. Okay, so now that was kind of weather stuff and basics. I want to go a little bit into the flying concepts. So cross-country flying in many ways is no different than just bumbling around at your home site. But there's a bit of a leap to be made. It's kind of a lot of it is mental, but some is also, it's worth having certain skills before you leave the nest, before you decide to go on your first cross country. And something you can practice at your home site or at a coastal site, probably best at a coastal ridge soaring site at first, is what I've called precarious landing practice. Is basically don't always land on something that's flat. Practice a side hill landing. Maybe if it's a sand dune or a slope that's clear where you can land, or if you don't want to set your wing down in that, practice a touch and go run through. Like, okay, I can side hill land on this. Maybe it's just ice plant covered and you don't want to get your wing into it, but just to touch through, kind of, okay, if I wanted to, I could have been putting it down here. Okay, now run a few steps, run it out, or even, these kind of barren hillsides. I'm not sure what regs are out there at Ed Levin, but hillsides like this, if you should feel comfortable being able to put it down on a hillside. You should also try to evaluate from the air what's so steep that if I land on it, it's likely that I'm gonna go rolling down that hillside, because certain things from above look flat, but they're actually pretty steep. So if you do decide to land there, you want to make sure that you can walk out of there. But you want to practice landing in areas that are not just big open flat fields, because once you commit to the cross country flight, you're gonna want to have some good landing zones in mind. But sometimes those landing zones, great landing hillsides, especially for paragliders, make really good landing zones. We don't have to quite do the fly on a wall of a hang glider when it comes to a hillside, but understanding that fly on a wall concept, not necessarily going straight downwind uphill, but we can kind of side hill swoop up a hillside, can be really nice. Also, the hillside can a much smaller area can act as a much longer landing zone on a hillside, because you can effectively, you set up for the bottom part of it, but then you can kind of swoop up at the last minute if you're overshooting, and it's an effectively much larger area if it's on the hillside. Then you need a much longer strip on the flat than you would on the hillside to be able to land it. And then if you are side hill landing, if you know, ideally you've evaluated which way if there's a crosswind component, you go into the upwind. You know, you're setting up upwind. The other thing is, it's hard to leave your sight because you kind of like, that's the LZ. If you've always taught, okay, this is the landing zone, I kind of call it like LZ suck. Like it's kind of a mental thing to break. Like, okay, that doesn't have to be my LZ. Like I can go somewhere else. Also, if the hills are working great here over which is considered my flying site, kind of like realizing, well, if it works great here, why isn't it working? Like, why wouldn't the next hill over work? Just because that's not my flying site, but just realizing if it works great here, the day's probably, I mean, the next hill over is feeling the same day that the flying site is, so you might want to try heading over there. Now, keeping the kind of a cone of landing zone options is, I like to think of it as a cone. The cone is defined by your glide ratio, and then it gets skewed by the wind. So the higher you are, that cone, first think zero wind. So it's an effect that cone is from you to the ground, and on the ground you've got this effective circle of like, this is as far as I can get to. And so as you're flying, you always have to evaluate as you're moving along. Okay, this is my, say it's very light wind conditions, this is my circle on the ground. As I'm getting lower, that circle's quickly shrinking. And as you're higher, then you got more options. It's getting to be a bigger circle. Within that circle, you've got to be constantly scanning, what are my landing options? Does that field, would that work? Okay, was there any obstacles? What, you know, if that didn't work, where would I go? It's kind of thinking a few steps ahead, but it's really always, put most simply, it's always keeping a usable landing zone in mind. And what's a usable landing zone depends partly on your skills, partly if you've done some precarious landing practice. Then certain things that might not look like a landing zone to one might be a fine landing zone to you. But that's for everyone to decide on their flying skills. The other thing to avoid is landing denial. I find I sometimes have landing denial. It's not good to spend your whole flight thinking about landing, because that might lead to landing. Where if you're thinking of flying and thinking of the next thermal, looking at like all the lift sources, that's definitely the way to have an extended cross-country flight. But the flip side of that is don't have landing denial, because then as you shrink that circle of options, you suddenly might have forced yourself into a really stupid landing area where that really wasn't necessary. That was just because you were in landing denial. So don't try to avoid what I call landing denial. Now back to that cone, it's going to shift drastically as you have wind. That circle is going to become kind of more elliptical, and the upwind edge of it might be not very far upwind from where you are, whereas it'll stretch quite a ways downwind. And keep in mind with the valley winds, things can change down in the valley. So you could have a certain valley where it could possibly be things could have gotten a lot windier while you were in the air. Once you start doing multi-hour cross-country flights, things could have developed a lot, and the wind on the ground could be stronger than your flying speed. If it comes to that, it's not the end of the world, but you want to suddenly, you're no longer looking upwind for your landing areas. You're looking downwind. Where are you going to back into? What's going to be? And at that point, you got to really be mindful of turbulence. The most open, ideally the most green, like a big alfalfa field. If you're out in the Owens somewhere or something, just a big long alfalfa field that you might be able to back into. Hopefully, the greener, wetter areas are less likely to have thermals coming off of them than the drier areas. So that would be a good place to put down and to be able to, even if you have to back in. And I've found sometimes at touchdown, one A and a lot of brake, or one A and one rear riser, kind of asymmetrically, kind of disables the wing very very quickly. But there's other techniques. That's just one I've kind of found for myself. Ideally, try not to get into that, but it just to kind of have some of these things in mind. You know, how would you, having thought about it, how you would approach it, and of course, doing some ground handling. You know, you're never too advanced of a pilot to do a lot of ground handling with your glider. If it's windy out, it's a great time to kind of learn how you would deal with your wing in pretty strong wind, especially if you've got a place that's relatively safe where you're not going to get dragged into something. Let's see.
And there's no rule that you can't do a nice parachute landing fall. I do it probably 80-85% of the time. I mean, you're flying for maybe 2-3 hours, whatever, and you're coming into a little tight spot. You don't have to do a nice little dandified landing. It doesn't matter. Just do a nice little parachute landing fall so you're safe. I do it most of the time. And sure, maybe you don't have to, but have a strong sense of self-preservation. So that's what I do.
So one thing speaking of turbulence, one thing I want to mention, often when you see in like, books like for flying and stuff, or it's often described as like a swirl. But turbulence is really these snaky vortex tubes that can that spin up and then they kind of contort like these weird snakes, and they shed their energy to ever smaller vortex tubes until they dissipate eventually as viscosity. But the stretching of these vortex tubes can momentarily like really amp up the spin in them. So a great little vortex tube that's often coming off the wingtips, and a heavily loaded tandem sheds a really nice little vortex tube, and you just feel that go right through your glider. If you've ever flown in the lee of a tandem, especially if they got a heavy passenger, you won't forget it. Now people are nowadays with modern gliders, some people coming out of spiral dives are able to hit their own vortex tubes on the way up, and those can have actually, I think, caused some people issues, because being heavily loaded on a solo glider, you can carve pretty good wingtip vortices, and if you fly right back up into it, especially if you're kind of at a funny angle of attack, that might not be the best time. It kind of sucks if you wake yourself, if you have an accident because of a turbulence you made yourself. That's kind of a bummer. So keep that in mind a little bit. But in general, turbulence is a very 3D feature. It's not so 2D as we always kind of see this nice little swirl drawn. And wind turbulence is often much greater than thermal turbulence. By the time thermal turbulence gets to be really strong, just pure thermals, those are some pretty ripping strong thermals. It's rare that if there's no wind that the thermals are producing such strong turbulence to make it, locally, yes, they can make some uncomfortable turbulence, but really wind is the one that you got to be really careful of. I just find, just being aware where the wind's coming from, and not putting yourself in the immediate lee of things, realizing, okay, smooth curve hills are less likely to have really harsh turbulence. Any sharp features can have really sharp turbulence. If you've ever flown Cheetah and it turns a little bit north and you're coming into the Cheetah Bowl, there's a perfect place to find some really wicked turbulence. I'm not saying go there, but if you've stumbled into it, you'll know it. It's that point that makes Cheetahs a very sharp feature, and the wind turns a little north and it'll just shred a really tight little kind of sideways rotor. So very sharp features, just got to be really aware of that. And then back, as I was talking about, valley winds and on a cross-country flight aren't necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of nice to know you can use a lot of these side valleys as if you're going to have a low save in a valley. There's a lot of these tributary valleys. You can often use the valley wind to ridge soar up, wait for a thermal, and then get out of that valley wind again and continue on your flight. Being aware, though, that anytime you're ridge soaring something when there's thermals ripping through it, it's a totally different story than coastal ridge soaring. Coastal ridge soaring is great because coastal ridge soaring, you really get to learn how the wind interacts with the terrain minus the thermals. So you learn wind, you learn how the river works. Thermals are how the air boils. And then when you have windy thermal conditions, it's a boiling river, and that gets to be infinitely complex. It's really, you know, it gets hard to imagine exactly what's happening, and you just have to, any kind of soaring near the terrain when there's thermals ripping through is much more dangerous soaring than just coastal ridge soaring. So ideally on a cross-country flight, you don't have to do it too much, and then you just have to be really careful. You have to kind of make that personal assessment. Is, you know, is this too much wind? Is this too rough? How close can I be getting? And you are exposed. Anytime you're really close to the terrain, there's that much less time to fix it if something does go south. So keep that in mind. But that said, the valley wind can kind of help, you know, under the right conditions, help you get a low save and then get back up into the thermals that are above the valley wind. Okay. And I think the last thing I want to say, and I'll let Martin and Ed talk, is evaluating your confidence. Like in my early years, I found I went through pretty large cycles of like overly confident and like unnecessarily scared, and it would cycle like that. And it's overly confident is not good, because then you find yourself doing things that you might not have the skills for. Flying around scared, thinking, oh no, it's like the glider's going to drop out of the sky anytime, kind of on me, or like it could do something to me, or like being just, you know, having low bump tolerance. That's not good either, because you're not focusing on your flying. You're focusing on just, you know, maybe being scared something's going to happen. If you're having a lot of that, especially if you stepped up to a wing that was too advanced for you, be aware of that. But the main thing is kind of checking in with yourself, just seeing like where you're at with your flying, how current you are, how much flying you're getting, how many hours, and also knowing, you know, as you get older, when is it time, like personally, to dial back. Like there's always going to be hotter, higher performing gliders coming out, and if you've got the time to, you know, put in 300 hours a year plus, then you can be on the latest greatest. If you're, you know, these days I'm probably around the 100 hours a year. So personally, I've just chosen not to go with the two line gliders, but that's a personal choice. Maybe if I, you know, in retirement I get to fly a whole lot, maybe I'll go to that 20 years from now. Maybe they'll have one riser by then. So that's the main thing, is just like, you know, always just kind of checking in with yourself, and also before a flight, like, you know, what's your mental state? Are you ready? Are you ready for it? Because, you know, it's sometimes you're going up there and you're really, it's like going into battle, and it's that you can choose, like they say, you can choose what you launch into. You don't always get to choose what you land into. So you kind of spending some time on launch. When you get to launch, take a good 15 to 20 minutes, evaluate it. Don't try not to be distracted by everybody else and everything else. Just kind of, like I said, 15 to 20 minutes is like a typical turnover cycle. So if something really ripping weird is going to come through launch, it might be once every 15 minutes. So it's really good to kind of take a little bit of time away from it. Just kind of, you know, it's exciting. You get out of the truck or whatever, you've hiked up to launch, it looks good, you're ready to go. And often, yeah, that's the case, you just go. But if it's a new site or something's, you know, maybe not totally looking ideal, it's really good to just kind of step back from the crowd and evaluate it for yourself. Or if you don't know, ask an experienced pilot, and make sure it's really an experienced pilot, not just the guy who talks the most, but it's that it's somebody that really knows their stuff. So yeah, with that, I'm gonna pass it to Martin. Martin's gonna talk about sky camping. It's something we've been doing. We've been flying tandem since he couldn't even talk yet, or actually since he was in his mom's belly. But he's now 10, and last 3 years we've each summer spent a week in the Alps doing some sky camping. So he's going to talk about sky camping a little bit.
All right, thank you, Honza.